Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore, and I have a special guest today, Allan Logan, who is the production manager at Bruichladdich. And thank you, Allan, for joining me today.
Pleasure, yeah, pleasure to join you, Drew.
So, you've been with Bruichladdich now for 20 years?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I joined in January 2001, so just at the very beginning. Well, when Bruichladdich was brought back to life under the hand of Jim McEwan when he came, and the co-owners of Mark Rainier and Simon Coughlin, when they came to Islay to buy Bruichladdich, I started with the team just then.
Very good. So we'll talk a little bit about you coming on board with the distillery, and we'll talk a little bit of distillery history as well.
Sure.
It has a fascinating history, and also dive into some Octomore. So your family actually has been in the distilling industry for quite a while.
Yeah. So I've my father, my connection with my introduction to the whisky industry. My father worked at Lefroy Distillery, so he worked there for about 30 odd years, just over 30 years, and before that he worked at Arbeg Distillery. And when I was growing up, we lived at Lefroy Distillery, so I was very familiar with the whisky making process growing up, and as I was growing up, I was very clear that I wanted to get into the whisky industry, but it was quite challenging to get in. Being somebody young with no experience, it was very difficult to get into the whisky industry because at that time there wasn't many opportunities to get a start, and if you did, they were looking for somebody that had more experience, more knowledge in terms of the process, but also in terms of maturity to be reliable and dependable for the whisky making process. So it was quite a challenge, and that's, I was very fortunate when Bruichladdich reopened in 2001 because Jim McEwan, I knew Jim when I was growing up. Jim coincidentally was my soccer coach.
Oh.
So he was the coach at the football team, and he obviously managed Bowmore at that time. And then when Bruichladdich reopened, he left Bowmore Distillery to come to Bruichladdich. So it was all good fortune. I already knew him. I was looking for a start, and he was keen to pass on his knowledge to the next generation. So before he retired, so I had the good fortune of obviously getting the start and then working 15 years with Jim. So my father worked at Lefroy. My grandfather also worked at Lefroy. All my uncles worked in various distilleries between Arbeg, Lagavulin, Bowmore. So it's very much in the family blood. My brother works in Bowmore Distillery, so yeah, there's a bit of friendly rivalry between the family just in terms of all the distilleries and who works where and who makes the best whiskey. But
Yeah.
it's all in good nature, yeah.
So it's fun looking out your window there because I see the
I've got a nice real-time backdrop here. Yeah, you can see the sea.
Yeah.
That's literally how close we are to the sea. Yeah.
So are the distilleries there competitive with each other, or is it kind of like a friendly rivalry?
Very friendly on the island, yeah. And I mean, to be honest, in the industry as a whole, like not just even on Islay, like in Scotland, everybody's very supportive of one another, and I think we have huge respect and admiration for what all the other distilleries do. There's not such a thing as a bad whiskey. Everybody's making great whiskey and all unique in their own way. I think locally here on Islay, I think because we're a small island, the population of Islay is only 3,000 people, so we tend to know one another. If not related, you know them, or you've been to school with them, or they're connected through a family, friend, or such thing. So it's very supportive. We're all very supportive of each other, down to the fact that like we all do make the same process. So like if we have a piece of machinery break down, we can phone another distillery, and likewise they can call us, and we can help each other out. Or even if it's borrowing yeast or barrels or bungs for the casks, we tend to share, help each other out in times of need. So yeah, no, it's it's like one big family, but we all do different things, and we will we often find, like you mentioned, you came to Islay before, and I think one of the common things when we meet people who come to Islay to make that pilgrimage to come to Islay and travel and visit the distilleries, we always get asked, what distilleries we would recommend to go to, and the truth is we recommend them all if you've got time. We say try and get around them all because they're all great. They've all got great stories and they've all got great whiskies.
Yeah. So there's 9. Has Port Ellen come on yet?
So Port Ellen, I think they've just restarted the building work. So I think it was they started the construction just before COVID, before lockdown started, and then it got put on hold, and then they've just recommenced the work just this month, I think. So yeah, okay. It's already started, and I think the groundworks for the new Farkin distillery on the other side of Port Ellen has just started as well. So
wow,
yeah, there's two distilleries getting built on the south side at the moment.
So if somebody's wanting to plan a trip to Islay now and they want to experience all of it, pretty soon they're going to need a week.
Pretty well, yeah, and a weekend a bit. Yeah, I think because there's now 9. There'll be soon be 11 if these two distilleries, and I think there's potentially another 2 in the planning stages of 2 more distilleries that are going to be planned. So yeah, you might need the 2 week vacation on Islay. Yeah.
So what was?
But yeah, it's all good. Yeah.
So what was the? Because when you were growing up, Bruichladdich was probably either. I know it was owned by White Mackay for a while, so it was basically making whiskies for blends, I guess.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
So was it kind of just like the odd man out distillery that everybody knew it was there, but nobody really paid attention to it?
Yeah, I think in that era, between the 80s and 90s, when I was growing up on Islay, I think the distilleries were quite different to what they are today on Islay. Like, I think it was in the 1990s, probably mid-1990s, Bowmore were the first distillery to have a visitor centre to actually welcome visitors. So up until then, the distilleries were more like factories where like there were big buildings, nobody really seen inside, nobody really understood what they were. Obviously I had a more of appreciation because I grew up in one. I grew up at Lefroy, but at that time there was no visitors. It was just basically a factory. They were making whiskey, and I think it slowly started to change. I think after Bowmore started, some of the other distilleries started to see the value in opening visitor centres and actually welcoming people in and showing them the process and educating them on the brands, and it suddenly started to see the change. And I think Bruichladdich was no exception. I think in that era, in the early 1990s, it was just like all the other distilleries where it was just producing spirit, and a lot of it was put into tankers and then shipped off to the mainland for filling into they were put off to the central warehouses on the mainland, and barrels were filled for blend, just as you said. So a lot of the whiskey was traded for going into blend, and a small percentage of the production would go into single malt, and that was quite common. So I think I do remember the distillery when it was operating. And as I say, I don't think we thought of it any differently from any of the other distilleries, but certainly from what it was then to what it is today, it's completely different in terms of still the same location, but totally different business model altogether.
Yeah. I sometimes get the impression, especially through your branding, that this is kind of the hip new distillery, but it actually has a history that goes way back to the 19th century.
Yeah, we've got quite a contrast, because the one thing that we so when we reopened Bruichladdich in 2001, what we had was a Victorian distillery that had all this Victorian equipment, some of it dating back to when the distillery was originally built, and some of them early 1900s. And because the previous owners hadn't really invested in Bruichladdich the way that some of the other distilleries had expanded over the time, they increased the production capacities and they made the process more efficient and more modern equipment. Bruichladdich was one of these distilleries that didn't have that rejuvenation. So we actually found it as a USP when we opened the distillery. We found that we were quite unique because we still had the open top mash tun, the old roller mill, the bobby mill, and the wooden washbacks, and the stills, and there was no automation in our process. And like, we know that a lot of our competitors in the industry today have advanced their process to bring in automation. So we had the guys that worked at the distillery before, that hadn't retired through the shutdown, had came back to, they had the skill of how the distillery ran, so they came back, and they were the guys that were teaching people like myself to pass on that knowledge. But one thing that we tried to protect, and today we still protect it, is that we don't have automation in the process. We still work on the fact that we're still using traditional methods, we're still using the traditional equipment, and it's all made by hand and made by the skill. It's the knowledge. We're not relying on any automation to make the whiskey, and even more so, we do everything in our power to protect the original equipment. So there's a bit of a story that goes with that. The mash tun, which was the original mash tun, it's over 140 years old. It's about 7-8 years ago we had to do a repair, and because of the outer cast of the mash tun, the shell of the mash tun is cast iron, so we had to do a repair, and we were advised by all the specialists that we should condemn the mash tun and have it replaced with a new stainless steel. It could be built in Germany, it could be here in like 6 weeks, and it was super fast, like for repair. But having to make a decision, it was myself, I had to make a decision that if you I had to make the decision, was I going to condemn a piece of equipment that had worked for 130 years and capable of doing another 130 if you make that repair, or do you condemn it and replace it, and then that's it, history, game over. So it wasn't, well, to be honest, it wasn't a difficult decision, because we just have to go back to what our values, and actually we want to keep this traditional, so we need to make the repair. So we had to convince the specialist that we had to make the repair. It did cost us, we actually had to stop distilling for 4 months because it was such a complex repair. And it cost us a lot more than probably what it would cost to buy a new mash tun. But at the end of the day, we've restored the mash tun into a workable condition that will go on and continue to work. So I think we are very committed to try and retaining that tradition. And we quite often get challenged with, like, there's opportunity to advance and bring in something, a new technology that would make the process more efficient or make it easier for the workers, but we then come back to saying that, but we've managed for 140 years without it, so we can continue to do this, because we're making whiskey, we're not changing the process. The process is still the same. So so I think that part of it we enjoy. But just to go on to finish that comment, I think on the distilling side, we really respect tradition, and we try and do everything to maintain that. I think on our packaging and our marketing, I think that we look at it very through a different lens, where we want to be more modern and challenging convention in terms of just the way that we market our product and do that. We don't really, we think that, I think and this goes back 20 years, it's not just current thinking. It was 20 years ago when we revived the distillery, and at the time Mark Rainier and Simon Coughlin and Jim McEwan had all come from different walks of life. Jim had come from the whisky industry, Mark and Simon had come from the wine industry, but they handled spirits, and they had a good understanding of the spirits industry. But they felt that the industry was like, there was full of tartan and like kind of old myths and things that were. So we wanted to be more real, more authentic, and be more transparent about what we do in the process, and more educational. So we wanted to do that, but also do it with a fresh lens. Like who says it has? We can't use like a coated bottle, or who says we can't? It has to be clear and it has to be tall with a screw cap. We can use different ways of doing things. So I think that was fresh, and it revived the us in terms of thinking, actually we can do this differently, because we're a new business. We're not actually, at the beginning, it was like, well, this is all new. Like we've not been, like we're really, because at that time we really brought Bruichladdich, we revived Bruichladdich and brought it back to life as a brand as well, because as a single malt, it wasn't really known. A lot of people didn't really know it existed, so it was a new beginning. So yeah, I think it would be different if you were reopening a distillery and you know it was already had, like, you know, everybody like it was had a global presence. It would be a big and bold move to go and change the packaging and the marketing.
Yeah.
But back then it was quite an easy decision to make.
Well, that's why I love when I look at your packaging, because it pretty much, wherever my camera is there, it's very straightforward and really gives you a lot of the detail that you're just now starting to see on other distilleries' bottles. You know, I mean, non-chill filtered, that's not something that, you know, a lot of people have talked about or pushed out there, and there's this thought with, you know, some are promoting it now, others are kind of still hiding it, and you know, for us as whiskey consumers, it kind of gives us the ability to choose, and as you say, learn a little bit more about, you know, what may make this whiskey better or not. Even if I don't understand what unchilled filtered means, it gets me to ask questions.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's exactly what we wanted, because when we were using these things as our talking points, so that when we were building the brand of Bruichladdich or Octomore, is that putting these statements on the bottle allowed people to, if they didn't understand what it means, ask the question, and we would happily tell them what it means. Because again, we wanted to be more transparent, because before that, I think one of Jim's frustrations and Mark's frustrations, they had the experience that people didn't talk about this in the industry before. Like in the 80s and 90s, all this was all, you know, kind of, it wasn't really open and transparent. People didn't talk about these points, whereas now, you know, every brand talks about it. You know, they talk about it openly because it's not so much a big deal. You know, I think consistency, once upon a time, I think when you're making a blend that you're selling as a brand, yes, you want consistency. But I think nowadays in single malt, people want variety. You know, they want different. You want to be able to taste the nuances and understand why they taste different. So we can educate them on, if it's down to the maturation, if it's down to the influence of the casks or the smokiness of the whiskey, the malted barley that we make the whiskey with, or if it's the nuances to do with the climate that it's made in, all these different things. We can educate them on that, and I think that's, to me, where I think that, you know, it's so interesting. The whole single malt category is so interesting because there's so much information, and you've got to remember well, certainly in Scotch whisky, it's very basic. We're only allowed to use malted barley, yeast, water, and the only other ingredient you can use is peat to dry the barley. Mm-hmm. So we're very restricted to what we can do, but there's such an array of different flavours. I think a lot of it does get, well, I know a lot of it the majority of it comes from the cask. So yeah, and we can use a wide variety of different casks for aging and all these things. But yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. But yeah, certainly talking about all these things now, it's more common than it was, you know, 20 years ago. Yeah, for sure.
So when I was at the distillery and doing the tour, I got to hear the story of how the distillery was rediscovered. It actually had been mothballed for, 6 years or so?
6 years, yeah.
And so you just had these casks sitting there sleeping with a couple of security guards, I guess, or the two employees that were still working there. So can you go into the story of how Mark discovered the distillery and went about purchasing it?
Yeah. So it's quite an interesting story. I think Mark had worked in he was a wine merchant in London, and he worked in his family's business, and they had a couple of shops in London, and Simon was his business partner, and they worked together. And at that point, they never met Jim. Jim worked in Bowmore, and through that time, they set up this an independent spirits business called Murray McDavid, and they were buying spirits, casks off Springbank and other distilleries and selling them. And I think Mark was at some event and he won there was a raffle, a tombola. I don't know if you know like a tombola. So he through a tombola he won a bottle of whiskey and he went to collect it, and it was a bottle of Bruichladdich 15-year-old. And he had never really heard of it, and he just thought it's another Scotch whiskey he'd never heard of. So at one point, not long after that, he opened the bottle to take a drink and was blown away by the elegance of the whiskey. It was just a perfect dram. So he wanted to discover more about this whiskey and started to do a bit of research into only to discover this was in about 96, I think 95, 96, just shortly after it was closed, to discover that the distillery had been closed by White Mackay. So I think this was around about the same time as him and Simon were starting to build this spirits business, that they were buying and selling whiskey and rum in their own branding, and they wanted to discover more, and they were basically trying to understand why the distillery was closed. And there was no at that time that you weren't the internet. There wasn't all this data on the internet or anything, so it was all he had to speak to people. He didn't really know a lot of people, but through time he started to discover that they shut it. It was mothballed. It was owned by White Mackay, and then White Mackay had actually sold out to Jim Beam Brands. So I think Mark then started to write to them, the owners of Jim Beam Brands, to understand why they were not doing anything with this distillery, and understand if they were going to do anything with the distillery, and then if they weren't, would they consider selling it? And it took quite a while. This was all done by letters back and forward, and I think quite often Mark would hear anything for a long time, and then he'd write to them again, and then somebody else would maybe respond, and it was back and forward, but not really making much progress. But then out of the blue, I think maybe 1998, 1999, I think out of the blue he received a letter to say that they were interested in selling the distillery. So he had to then start putting a business plan together to get investors. And there is a story of when Mark and his brother, during this time, just before they owned the distillery, Mark was trying to buy it, and him and his brother took a holiday in Scotland, and they decided to cycle around the west coast playing golf. And they were like cycling around the islands and playing some golf. And because he came to Islay to play golf, he decided that when he was here he wanted to cycle to Bruichladdich because he knew, and he wanted to be there in person, to go to the distillery in person, not really knowing and understanding what he wanted to see. So he remembers, he tells the story of him cycling to the distillery and coming into the village and cycling up to the main gate, and the gates were closed, there were chains on the gate, and there was a sign saying closed to visitors. And he was like standing at the gate looking through the railings, looking in, and he seen one of the caretakers walking past the courtyard, and there was nobody else about. He shouted to him, is it okay to come in? And the caretaker says, no, you can F off. And he thought, how rude, and I think that kind of memory stuck with him. And ironically, after Mark bought the place, the caretaker kept his job. So,
oh, nice! It didn't affect him too much.
It all the business plan, getting investors, and then I think in the year 2000 the deal was done, and then that was the case. That was when it was restarted, and we officially kind of started the work in the project in January 2001.
So you were on board in January 2001?
Yeah, just at the very beginning. Yeah, I was just fortunate, as I say, I wanted to start my career in the whisky industry. I knew Jim. It was all good fortune just at the time that this was all happening, where Jim was taking the lead in bringing the distillery back to life. He had to try and recruit some of the guys that worked here, but what happened during the 6 years it closed, there was about 3 or 4 of the guys who worked here had actually reached retirement age, so they decided not to come back to employment, and the ones that were still below retirement age and still willing decided they left. They'd gone off and got other jobs, but then decided to come back to the distillery. They had the know-how, and so it was all quite exciting at the time, reforming a new team. And yeah, I mean, the first 6 months we didn't make whiskey. We were basically restoring the distillery and bringing it back to life, because no maintenance, nothing had been done for 6 years, so things had seized. Some of the machinery needed overhauled. Place needed cleaned and painted. There was birds nesting, everything. So it was a mess. Yeah, it was. We did think, at the beginning, it was hard to imagine, will we ever make whiskey? Because it was like, it wasn't in a really bad state, but it was hard to see that there was life in it, because the equipment was so old. There was a lot of rust. Everything was just like, it was hard to believe that, it would make whiskey. And even if you look at the contrast today, my memory going back to what the distillery looked like, it's just unbelievable that we turned it around to what it is today.
Was there
without
ever
really changing?
Was there ever a discussion about that old equipment, saying, do we really want to go forward with this, or was it always, no, we got to make this work?
Yeah, I think it was always, we've got to make it work. I think twofold. I think that they put everything they had into buying the distillery, but B, I think we recognised that it was a USP at the beginning, was that we've got a Victorian distillery. We've got something that's very special here, that we're still making whiskey, the traditional way, the traditional equipment, which is quite unique today, and even 20 years ago it was still quite unique, and it was something that we took pride in, and it was just something magical about the distillery. It had that great history, that it still had the original mash tun. The mill was 115 years old, it was still very old, and the stills had such a great history. I think that it just had something about it that we had to restore it and try and keep it. So I don't think there were ever really at a point where we felt that, yeah, we've got to, we need to change this equipment, because it won't do what we needed to do. The equipment has worked perfectly for the last 20 years. So.
Yeah. Now, you had someone who had a lot of experience there, the late Duncan McGilvery. And how valuable was that in having somebody who knew that equipment?
Yeah, I mean, invaluable. I mean, today, I don't think we would have ever got off the ground in 2001 if it hadn't been for Duncan, because Duncan McGilvery had worked at the distillery before its closure in 1996. He had worked for about just over 20 odd years in the distillery, and he was an engineer, so he knew every nut and bolt. He knew every sound and everything about the process. So he came back on board when the distillery was revived. He knew everything. He managed to get, he knew everything it needed to get the distillery back up on its feet. And he was the one that was telling Mark and Simon and Jim, this will work, this distillery will work again. So they put their faith in him, and we all joined and we followed in terms of done what needed to be done to get the distillery running again. And in the early days, I learned so much of Duncan. Just his, not just the way that he understood the equipment, but also the process and the way he was in life. He had a very much can-do attitude, so it was never this is broken, it can't be fixed, we need to replace it. He always had the attitude that this can be repaired, we will get this going again, and we will. And it was always a positive attitude to things, and I think that to me, and he led by example, because he wasn't one of these people who would talk and not do anything. He was always followed through, and I think that gave me huge inspiration in my career, that learning along these ways of working with somebody that's so positive and willing to just mend and make do. And don't be wrong, there is points where you've got to give up and say this will never work again, or something's at the end of its life. But he came from a generation where it wasn't a throwaway society. It wasn't just we'll go and buy a new one, or we'll have 2 spares sitting there. He was one that was always he always repaired and very creative in terms of the way that he would he could make things work. So he was a bit of a genius. So yeah, so I mean, again, he played a vital part in the Renaissance of bringing Bruichladdich back to life. And I think just in terms of the ethos of what actually happens with Bruichladdich today, like in the early days, Jim and Duncan were both Irish, so they were both born and bred on the island, and they have a huge, respect for the community and what Isle life is about. So I think that had a big influence on Bruichladdich as a business, because it wasn't just a business we were opening just to make whiskey to make lots of whiskey to sell and internationally, and it was like, Bruichladdich wasn't just going to be like a postcode, that we made the whiskey at, and it didn't. I think actually, creating jobs for the community, sharing, giving opportunities for people on the island, whether it's in the farming community to grow barley for the distillery, or whether it was like local contractors or hauliers, or to get work and to kind of build that community around the distillery, which we still have today, and it's growing over time, and it's so important to us because we are a community-based distillery. Like we're all island people, like we all live on the island, we all want it to be sustainable, so you want to kind of support in other places, so like when Bruichladdich was closed, the hotel in Port Charlotte was closed because there was no trade. But now it's reopened, and actually there's more hotels, there's more guest house, because there's people that come to the island to visit the distillery. So it generates a huge support economy for the island, which is great.
So what did you do once you had all of these old casks sitting there and you're not producing for some time? Were those casks usable? Did you end up putting those in bottles and selling those first?
Yeah. So that was one of the things. So when we started in 2001, so there was a lot of casks that was acquired in the purchase when Bruichladdich. When it had been closed, the whiskey was still maturing in the warehouses, and when the purchase was done, we purchased the stock that was sitting in the warehouses. And Jim when we were, Duncan and myself and a team of people were working getting the distillery up and running, and while we were doing this, Jim was working with another team, going through all the stocks, evaluating the quality of the stocks that we had inherited. Now, there was probably about 2 or 3 different grades. What would happen was a lot of the casks that were in the warehouses were filled in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s and 90s predominantly, and a lot of the casks were old casks that had been filled, that maybe third fill cask, second, third, sometimes fourth fill cask, that had no life in it. So Jim had to go through and basically inspect every barrel to check the quality, to see if the cask was performing or not, so that he could then understand. So there was casks that were actively working well and the whiskey was great and it was kind of ready to sell. There was casks that were okay and maybe given a bit of time would develop, and there was casks that were just, nothing was happening because there was no life left in the wood. So what we had to then do is start to buy new wood to then start transferring the whiskey that wasn't maturing into the new wood, and then start a program of reviving that whiskey and bringing it back to life. So that started a program of reviving all that whiskey, and we started using sherry casks and using wine casks, a lot of European casks. And I think the reason there were a couple of reasons. Availability of getting European casks was there was a lot of availability, but also it helped because the European oak is a lot more, it's a bit more porous than the American oak. The grain of the wood is a bit more open, so what you find is that you get quicker influence from a European oak than you will from American oak. So part of the reason was we needed to speed up the maturation a little bit, because some of this whiskey had already been aging for minimum 6, but some of it was like 10, 15 year old. So we wanted to kind of not fast track, but bring it back and try and recover it quickly. So using European cask help. But then what that done was actually open up, because Mark and Simon's connection coming from the wine industry, it gave us a great insight into they had great contacts into like some of the great chateaus, from Bordeaux, from all over the world really, but mainly France. But we got access to some amazing wine casks that were really enhancing the flavour of the whiskey, and started to give a whole new profile of whiskey that it was mind-boggling in terms of the standard type of whiskey that you're used to trying, and then trying all these amazing whiskies that have been finished and things. So what quickly started to become what was a reaction to the situation of the whiskey was dead and we needed to revive it, suddenly opened this opportunity of creating a library of different flavours, because we were using such a wide range of different casks to try and enhance it.
Yeah.
And suddenly Jim was starting to get really excited in the early years, because he was like he worked in Beaumont and he worked as a kind of distiller and a blender, but he was always in that era, he was always like given a recipe to work to create. But whereas he was now in a playing field where he had all these different flavours and there was no recipe, he could create what he wanted. So all of a sudden he got very creative, and and Bruichladdich quickly became renowned for having lots of products, because Jim, every time he went into the warehouse, he would come up with something new, and we thought, well, we'll just release this, and a new limited bottling. So I think quite quickly we became renowned for doing lots of limited releases, weird and good things, in terms of it was like some of the bottlings, like it was I remember the very first 20-year-old that we released. It was called Flirtation, and the whiskey was like almost pink, like like Ribena. It was very pink and dark, and it was just something that was totally. I think me and Jim had came up with this name like Flirtation for it. It was released about Valentine's Day, and it was trying to imagine it would attract for Valentine's Day, and it was pink and romantic, but it was just. All these things started to evolve very, very quickly off the back of trying to revive the stock that hadn't been really maturing.
Yeah.
Well, it was good times, and we've continued that journey of terms of being very explorational in terms of the casks that we use. So we don't tend to just like stick to like a ratio of the barrels we fill, and these are for these core products. We're very experimental in terms of the wood that we use, and we've got a huge variety of different types of oak in the warehouses maturing away. And for us, it's like I often explain to people when you come in, if you go into the warehouses, we're in control of what we're making. We're making all these different types of spirit, and we're in control of the wood that we buy. And if we were just picking like a couple of types of barrel, if we were just picking like ex-bourbon casks and ex-sherry casks, and we would have them, and then that would be your tolerance to play with. You would have your bourbon style whiskey, and you'd have your sherry style whiskey, and that's what happened once upon a time. Like back many years ago, Jim told me that was common in the industry. Like it was quite common. It was just bourbon and sherry casks. There wasn't a great selection, and the quality was up and down. Sometimes there were good casks, and sometimes they were bad. But now, because what we do is we're actually selecting casks from all over the world, and looking at the quality of the spirit that's been in it before. And actually what this is doing is creating an array of different flavours for us. And as I say, I often explain to people, it's a bit like your spice rack at home, or your cupboard. The more spices and ingredients you have, the more creative you can be with what you're preparing. Whereas if you only have a limited amount of options, you're limited to what you can do. So for us, that's our philosophy in terms of wood purchasing is keep being creative, trying different things. We have the good fortune that we're making three different types of spirits. So we're making Bruichladdich, which is unpeated, Bruichladdich, which is medium peated, it's about 40 ppm, and then the Octomore, which is really super heavily peated. And then using these different barrel types, you get all sorts of different flavours, which is again, gives us lots of options. And you can see that there's, you're using really smoky whiskies like Octomore, and then using really sweet like Sauterne wine casks or Bordeaux wine casks that are really giving different dimensions to the flavour that you would get from And to be honest, I'm not putting down. Bourbon casks are amazing. Sherry casks are amazing. We buy a lot of bourbon casks. I mean, we probably the most casks we buy are bourbon. Actually, we buy more than half is definitely bourbon that we buy.
You almost think it's going to get to a point where sherry casks are going to get very hard to find because so many people are focused on them.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and it's funny because I've seen in the 20 years I've been, there was an era where like sherry casks they're really struggling to get rid of them. They were basically like there was a period where like you could buy them really cheap, and there was a huge a selection of them available. It's gone the opposite way now. It's very difficult to get sherry casks. The price has got very expensive because there's such a huge demand for them. I think those who can buy them are very fortunate to get them, and we know that sherry production for a while was on the decline because not many people are consuming sherry, so it's difficult to get authentic sherry casks. Like a lot of the sherry casks that are being used today are almost seasoned, or they are seasoned in terms of like there's a process for kind of seasoning the wood with sherry just to get them ready for maturing whiskey, rather than actually sherry casks that have been maturing sherry for X a number of years.
Wow. So you came out with Octomore. What was the first release of Octomore? When was that?
So the first release was about 2006, 2007, I think. Yeah. And the first Octomore we done was called the Beast, just because it was a bit of an animal in terms of the smokiness. It was really, really different to the style of whiskey that we were doing. So it was kind of nicknamed the Beast in terms of just its style. And it was 80 parts per million, so that was the first ever Octomore that we distilled at the distillery. And then from there, we started to create the Octomore series, which was Octomore 1, and then we went on to Octomore 2, and then it was Octomore 2 that we decided to do a second edition. So when we done Octomore 2, actually we had been laid down Octomore in some wine casks, red wine casks, and we decided that actually it would be interesting to put a parallel. So you've got Octomore 2, which was the 5 years old in bourbon cask, and then Octomore 2.2 was Octomore 5-year-old in this red wine cask. So you had a parallel to taste side, and then it really evolved from there that it made sense to always have like a parallel. So you always have 0.1 would be the standard Octomore in bourbon cask, so that's your kind of core, your bench, and then you would always have a variation of Octomore in a different type of cask, which would be the 0.2, and then the 0.3 system came later when we were growing local barley locally here, and Octomore Farm, which the whiskey is named after, which is less than 2 miles from the distillery, they started growing barley for us, so we kept their barley separate and we made it into Octomore. So it was quite a nice story. The barley grown in Octomore Farm became Octomore Whisky.
Nice.
So we decided to create that 0.3 series, so that every year the farm was growing barley, it was the evolution of the Isla growing. So 0.3 is always using the local barley coming from Octomore Farm. So it's kind of uber provenance in terms of it's grown in Octomore Farm, it's distilled as Octomore Whisky. It's certainly just another dimension. So we continued that, and then laterally there, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, through innovation, we decided that it would be quite cool. Some of the whisky that we'd been trialling, like I was talking about earlier, like exploring with the cask types, we had started trialling Octomore in virgin oak, so barrels that had no previous content. and the results were amazing, and we thought, well, it would be great to bring this to the market. So we created the 0.4 series, where Octomore 0.4, like in any of the series, if there's a 0.4, it's generally with virgin oak.
Okay, and so, and before I dive into this next question, let's talk about ppm for people who may not understand that, and phenols as a measurement for the amount of peat smoke, and maybe a description of how it affects the whiskey, because some people will, I've heard say, you know, this one is lower ppm than the other, but it tastes a whole lot more smoky than another whiskey does.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's such a big topic. I mean, there's different measurements of the ppm that's used in the industry. The standard that we try to maintain is that the measurement is done in the malt, not in the whiskey. So it's common when they make the malt that you measure the ppm. That's the specification that we, with Bruichladdich, we give a specification to the maltsters. For Octomore, we don't specify. We ask them to make it as peaty, as smoky as they can. So there's a variability with Octomore. One batch could be 80, the next one could be 100, it could be 120, it could be 129, it could be 220. So there's a variability there. But that's what we like about Octomore, that it's got no parameters in terms of the phenol content. We measure the malt at the point when it's been malted. They measure the phenol content at that point. Now there's a couple of different methods. One of the old traditional methods is colorimetric method of measuring it, and that was one thing that was commonly used. But through time has been a bit more advanced, and the maltings that make the malt for us, they send it to a lab and they use HPLC to measure the malt. So it's quite an advanced process of measuring it. So we get the phenol content measured by a laboratory, and we get a certificate of analysis that tells you the phenol content of the malt before you distill it. Now, during the distillation process, you're mainly through distillation, your phenols are breaking down, and actually, if you remeasure the phenol content in the whiskey, you would find it would be a lot less than what you have in the original malt, because you've lost phenols through the process. But to try and keep a kind of, I suppose, a standard or a reason, to keep it, I suppose, there's an unwritten rule. It's not anybody's. There's no law or anybody says it. But I think it's just a kind of an understanding in the industry that everybody that talks about phenols talks about it in the malt, not in the spirit, because it would confuse things if you were saying, you know, because if we could say like Octomore in the spirit might be, I don't know, 60 or 70 parts per million, but the malt is something else. So we talk about the malt, and what we find, and you mentioned it there, is that when people taste it, like they often describe, oh, I thought it would be more smokier in this, or if you taste different whiskies that are maybe the same BPMs but they're totally different styles or characters, and the smoke is more pronounced on one than it is on the other, but I'm led to believe on paper they're both the same. Now, absolutely that happens because there's a lot of factors. So, like as I say, through distillation you lose phenols. The origin of the peat also has a big impact. So the style of peat, or the character of peat that is used to dry. So the best way of describing this, I'll use an example. So our peat that we use at the moment, we have explored with using Isle of Peat, but actually our peat, openly and honestly, comes from the northeast of Scotland. So we're not using Isle of Peat, we're using peat that's coming from the northeast, because that's where our barley's malted, and there's a peat source that's quite close to it. It's the old Caledonian forest, and there's a lot of broken down, like decade of, like, the Caledonian forest was covered through the ice, the ice age. I think there was the forest had all kind of broken down and it was covered over, but through years and years, like hundreds of years of later, the peat that is there has got a lot of forest tree roots and all sorts of things in the peat, and the peat that we use has to dry our barley gives us more of a woodier, it's like a campfire. So when you taste Octomore, you taste Bruichladdich, you can resemble that wood flavour, like if you're burning wood in a bonfire, or if you're sometimes a bit more barbecue, because you get that kind of charcoal barbecue flavour coming through, but it resembles the, I don't know if you're burning wood, and it's a smoke that we're all familiar with because most people are used to that smell.
Yeah.
Now, if you use Isla peat, which is totally different origin, and the peat here is more kind of saturated in iodine and salt and stuff from the sea, and you've got that penetration from the salt, the sea, the salt water, you find that you get a totally different style of peat, more iodine, more medicinal flavour coming through. So that's one thing. These are two things that will create different styles of smoky whisky. But then the next factor is, in the distillation, the speed and the shape of your still and the way that you distill will have a factor, and the cut points in distillation will have a factor on how smoky you get. Now, one of the common debates or discussions that we have is that between Bruichladdich and Octomore we have very slightly different cut points, and sometimes we get if you have a glass of Bruichladdich and a glass of Octomore, on some of our Octomore expressions sitting beside Bruichladdich, you smell the Bruichladdich and it's more smokier than the Octomore on the nose, and that happens.
Yeah.
And then on the palate, it's a different style. You get different flavours, and the smoke is there, and sometimes it's really strong, and sometimes Bruichladdich is really pronounced. Well, the Bruichladdich against Octomore is really pronounced, and people say, I thought Octomore was not that peaty compared to Bruichladdich. We get that conversation a lot. The truth of it is that's exactly what happens, because we change the cut points and we distill really, really slowly to try and get Octomore more elegant, because we know the phenols are high. And when Jim, the very first time we distilled Octomore, we weren't sure what was going to happen, because this was malt at a specification that was really, really high. And when it was running through the distillation, the smoke was really pronounced, but it was really, really smoky. There was no other flavour to it, and it was just one-dimensional. And Jim wrestled with it a lot, and Jim's mind was thinking, I remember I was on the stills, I was at the distillery, and we were working there, and he was standing by the still, measuring it, and trying to get the different cuts, and tasting and nosing. And he said he wanted Octomore to be three-dimensional. He wanted the peat to be there, but he wanted the sweetness to come through from the malted barley, and the floral flavours from the fermentation. He wanted that flavour to be present, but he also wanted the elegance of the Bruichladdich style, because we've long neck stills, and we've got long tall neck stills. So by distilling slowly, we get the elegance. And it also means that you get the purification, because the slower you distill, the more copper contact you get, the more elegance and the more flavour that's coming through from your base spirit is coming through. So we're actually sacrificing some of the phenols through the distillation to get some of that other flavour coming into the Octomore, so that you get that more three-dimensional flavour from Octomore that you would get from another peated whisky that is a bit more really pronounced. And that, to me, was part of my learning, and it was very creative of Jim to think like that, because generally it would be just get it as smoky as you can, and we really want something to kind of pip the bar. But this was something that was totally different, and I think that's some of the magical about Octomore, because on paper it's very strong, in terms of high ppm, it's cask strength, it's 60 ppm, it's 5 years old. On paper, you kind of think this is going to be undrinkable. Actually, when you taste it, there's no other spirit like it. It's amazing, because you get that surprise, that wow moment of discovery of wow, something can taste. It's got the smoke, but it's also got the elegance. It's got the the sweetness coming. It's it's a very, very pleasant discovery on your palate that you're not expecting. You're expecting something I think because generally if you're told about all these factors and you understand what that means,
Yeah.
you're probably in your mind you're thinking this is going to be unpleasant, but then you're like, wow, this is not unpleasant, this is really, really good. So yeah, I mean, I think it's great, and we've then obviously continued over the years making Octomore in that way of trying to get that balance of the different dimensions coming through. So we often find that you might not, on the nose, you might not find Octomore as smoky as you would Bruichladdich or another smoky whiskey that's at a lower phenol content.
Yeah.
But it's to do with the distillation, and it's to do with the style that we make it, because we want it that way.
So just to verify what you just said, when we were doing the warehouse tour and we were being offered the Octomore straight from the cask, everybody's eyes were big. We're hearing about it, and I'd never had Octomore before at that point, and so I really had no idea what to expect, but I love smoky whiskeys, and so I was expecting this blast of smoke, and it was amazing to me. Part of me thought, I wonder if it's the combination of high proof and that smoke, that they actually kind of work together to also pull down some of that overwhelming experience, like a distraction.
Yeah.
One distracts from the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the great thing about it. It's very hard to describe that. Like, it's hard to. We've often been like, people say to us like, "What's it like?" And it's hard to describe it as something because there's nothing like it.
Yeah.
And it is difficult because within whiskey, you could say, right, okay, yeah, it's a smoky whiskey. It's a bit like Bruichladdich. It's a bit like one of the other peated whiskies, Lefroy, like, but it's not. It's not like any of them.
Yeah.
Well, and it's hard to. Yeah.
I was going to say, I get your, the Caledonian forest. When I smell this, rather than getting that kind of briny smell that I get, and this is the 12.1, I am getting much more of the fruits, and I also get this smell of autumn. It smells like burning leaves to me. Yeah. Grasses, toasted almonds, all these kind of little notes that I get in it.
Yeah, you do. You definitely. It's more a smoke that everybody can resemble to, and I think that's something that we find quite warming. That it's something that's quite familiar in terms of that kind of style of smoke. And I mean, in my own journey, in terms of my personal journey in drinking whiskey, when I was old enough to drink, or probably actually I wasn't old enough to legally drink, but my first ever experience with whiskey was drinking Lefroy whiskey that my father made, and I thought that had put me off whiskey for life because honestly, and it's not like today I can drink Lefroy, but back then my palate wasn't used to it. I was very young, inexperienced, and I took a taste of whiskey. I didn't enjoy it because it was so smoky, just a taste that I could not connect with. But when I started working at Bruichladdich, the whiskies that Jim had been working on in the warehouses were all unpeated whiskies. So that started my journey on whiskey, because I got into drinking unpeated whiskies, and I developed a connection with drinking that style of whiskey, and we were sampling, and it wasn't so powerful. And I started to drink that, but I was always a bit sceptical about the peated whiskies, because we were making Octomore and Bruichladdich, and we would taste the new make spirit. And it was like there was no wood influence, and it was a bit smoky. I was never really a big fan of it, but my mind was always going back to that experience with the Lefroy. But I was warming to the the unpeated style whiskies. But then as Bruichladdich started to become more mature, and we started to work with it, and then Octomore was released, and also Bruichladdich, we started with a 5-year-old Bruichladdich. Actually, through time, I started to develop this interest and ability to drink it, and I think it was that familiarisation of drinking something that it had a smoky flavour to it, but it was more something like I resembled to a bonfire or a campfire, or something that I wasn't put off by, and it was more approachable than something that was strong that medicinal flavour that I didn't really enjoy. But to be honest, and it's no bad reflection on Lefroy, today I can drink Lefroy, and I quite happily drink a glass of Lefroy, because my palate is more mature and I can take that flavour. But when I was younger, I couldn't. So, but yeah, I think that journey into peated whiskey is quite interesting, because if you've ever had a smoky whiskey and you didn't enjoy it, it's not to say you won't like them all.
Yeah.
I think that it's finding the right one, and Port Charlotte and even Octomore is a good approachable whiskey that you can drink, that is not going to it's a different style that is very approachable.
I like to say it's a mindset change, because the first time I had a Isla whiskey, it was the first time when I said, I can really tell you what this tastes like. It was the first whiskey that I got a flavor note in my head, and it was Band-Aid.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And so, and it was a cheap Isla whiskey, a blend, and it did set me off on wanting to taste other peated whiskeys. But what I learned is that it's just a frame of mind. If you go in and you drink a peated whiskey thinking it's going to be sweet, then you're going to get an experience that's not going to match what your mind is thinking. So I always tell people, just forget everything you know about whiskey and approach this like a completely different drink. It's savory, it's smoky, and it's more like dinner than it is dessert.
Yeah, that's funny you should say that, because that's something that we often say about Octomore as well. When you're introducing Octomore to people, it's like, forget everything you know. This is something that you need to kind of clear your mind, not kind of think what it's going to be, and just go into this with an open mind, because just exactly what you've just described. If you go into it expecting something, I mean, a bit slight contradiction, because if you, as we've said before, like, I think some of the enjoyment of discovering Octomore is that you think it's going to be this and it ends up being that, and you're like, wow, blown away.
Yeah.
But we've also been trying to educate people so that they're more open to trying it, because I think a lot of people, some people have got the confidence to try it. Some people say, no, I'm not. I don't like peated whiskey. I'm not going to try it. I've tried something smoky. I don't like it. That sounds disgusting, because it's really going to be really smoky. It's really strong in alcohol, and it's really young. I'm not going to enjoy it. And they'll just say no. And that's when you've got to say, forget everything you know. Actually, give this a go, because you might be surprised.
It's amazing. I feel like when I'm teaching people about Scotch, the first thing I have to do is I have to say, they're not all smoky.
That's true.
They're not all smoky. Then once I get them off of the ledge and saying, I don't want to taste it because all Scotch is smoky, and I get them into a Highland or Speyside, I will then say, okay, now let's go back and have smoky, but let's change your mindset.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, definitely. It's a path, and again, I suppose you can't generalise, because we've seen, people just tasting Octomore, don't like whiskey in general, tasting Octomore or tasting Port Charlotte, and wow, I like this, but I don't like whiskey, and you're like, wow. So it does, people do get, can go straight into it, but I think, like my own journey, I started off with the quite typical getting into spirits and drinking, the lighter unpeated whiskies first, and then getting into the more smokier ones as your palate develops, and you know what to expect, and you can appreciate the flavours and the nuances of the smoke that maybe when you're younger you don't really appreciate.
Yeah. So in the 12.2, it's got brighter fruits to it. It seems like it's like orange, honey, those kind of things coming through.
Yeah, I think the sherry influence there has certainly been interesting with Octomore, because it's got that kind of dried fruit coming through, and a bit of sweetness, dried sweetness coming through. So yeah, I think the sherry influence is playing its part there.
Yeah, I get a little bit more of the tannins too from the wood in that one.
Yes.
It's amazing how different these two whiskeys are, both being in the Octomore series, but that's part of the charm of these.
Yeah, that absolutely. Yeah, that's what we want, is that discussion point about, well, tried this one and this is this style, tried it in this type of casks, and that experience of seeing the difference. And I think having like almost the point one is always the kind of the bench, the core that gives you that reference point to always to check back on.
Yeah, and then the 12.3. What is the this is local barley, and I got into this conversation with Ian McAllister over at Glen Scotia, because I did a whole series on Campbelltown whiskey and the origins of Scotch, and we were talking about Bear grain.
Yep.
Is that the grain that you're using from Isla, or is this
for,
different?
Yeah, not for Isla or for the Octomore. So we do grow beer barley, but we actually get it grown in Orkney, where it's more suited to growing. So we work with the Agronomy Institute in Orkney, and they work with 3 small farms that are growing beer barley, and they supply us with the amount of beer barley every year. So we've been making beer barley since 2006.
Okay.
We make a small amount. It's about 1% of our production. It's very, very small, but it creates an amazing whiskey, because the great thing about the beer barley is that it creates a different profile of whiskey. It's because of the grain. It's an old ancient grain. It's a low producer of starch, so it yields lower than more modern conventional barley that you would get today. So there's not a high amount of starch. You get a lot more husk from it. So when to be honest, it's quite suited for like milling, for making flour, for making bread, or for making biscuits. But it's actually, when you distill it, you get a lot of flour and a lot of husk from it, but not a lot of starch. So hence the reason why it doesn't commonly get used today for distilling, because it yields low.
Yeah.
But what interests us about it, and we make a small amount of it every year, is that because of that low level of starch and actually high level, it actually brings through different flavours. So you get more pronounced flavours from the fermentation, because the fermentation, like the esters, there's more flavours coming through that are left over from the yeast. You get more cereal notes coming, because you've got more flavours coming from the husk and the flour, because there's less starch. So actually, we find that working with beer barley creates this different profile of whiskey that is rewarding enough to keep doing it.
Nice.
Whereas a lot of people would say, actually, no, the yield's terrible, we don't get enough spirit off that, so we'll stop doing it. We're actually working with it to get that different profile is rewarding enough to say, actually, we like this style of whiskey, and it plays leverage into what we believe that barley plays an influence on the flavour. Not hugely, we're not saying that it's the most predominant flavour, but it plays an influence. It's the fundamental ingredient that you use in whiskey making. So it's got to have an influence, and using different varieties, and especially some of these older varieties, you certainly see the difference in the whiskey profile.
Yeah. So on 12.3, this one seems to go more for the darker fruits, the figs, raisins, that sort of. So what is the barreling process for this?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to remind myself. With 0.3, it's generally bourbon cask, but then Adam will use he'll select a variety of different wine casks just to mix it up a little bit. And I think in this one he has used some wine casks, fortified wine casks, and some other wine barrels that can work well with the bourbon cask. So we generally kind of play it up a bit. Like sometimes we will use more bourbon and less wine or sherry cask, but in this instance he's used quite a high proportion of ex-wine casks.
It's interesting because it has this minerally character to it, and then it has this dark chocolate that came to me right on the finish, which is really nice.
Yeah. It's again, it's one of our favourites. I think the local aspect of it, but we always like the 0.3 because it's got. Also, I always get this. It's a little bit more drier, but it's not briny, salty, but it's like bit more savoury than some of the other whiskies that we produce. It's not as sweet as some of the other whiskies, and that kind of savoury note I think is something that we like with the Point 3 series.
I hear there's a 10-year coming out.
Yeah, we're working on a 10-year-old, so we tend to rotate. So sometimes it's either a 0.4 or a 10-year-old is the fourth release. So we don't have a 0.4 virgin oak cask every year or every release. Sometimes we do a 10-year-old in the middle. So
Okay.
just to keep looking at Octomore as it develops with age, because predominantly they're quite young, but with we like to then look at the reference point of it being 10. We hope to someday, start looking at 12 and 15-year-old as well,
Wow.
but just building up the inventory of that to be able to do that. So
Yeah.
very
I
excited.
wonder how the smoke fades over time, because it seems like the real
It's
character is there early on.
Yeah. We've got a few special barrels, and it's quite interesting. Yeah, it does fade, and the more influence from the wood comes, and it is another the influence on the barrel and the smoke, and as it gets more intense, it's quite interesting. We've got a few interesting things working away, and hopefully it won't be too long before we can share them.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, Allan, I appreciate all your time today and for going through the history and for letting me taste these wonderful whiskeys. And I really look forward to seeing what you guys come up with in the future.
Yeah, no problem, Drew. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and hopefully we'll see you in Islay again soon.